I want to help clients understand the risks and liabilities, the indemnities, the warranties, whatever you want to call it, in their contracts, to be able to visualize what that might look like, to be able to articulate it, and say in practical terms, what does this actually mean to our business? So HMRC invited us to give them an industry perspective on the outsourcing, the statement of work guidance that they were updating. Because most recruitment businesses at some stage are going to go through an exit, are going to be sold and bought by somebody else.
Hello and welcome back to Your Own Accounts, Qdos' podcast. I'm Sam Cox.
I'm Seb Maley.
And we're joined today by a friend of Qdos, Stephen Rookes of SRC. Nice to have you here today.
Thank you.
I assume you ran here today.
that was yesterday.
I think anyone who's familiar with your LinkedIn activity will have seen quite a lot of your ultra marathon running activities. So I suppose in terms of getting to know you a little bit, that's a fairly interesting place to start. You're a big marathon runner. How many miles was it in the last 3 days?
So the last 2 days I've been over to the Yorkshire Three Peaks. So 34 miles and 6,500 feet. Plus lots of mud and rivers and rock climbing.
And you made it down to London on the day afterwards as well. Lots of energy.
have you always done that, Stephen?
No, probably for the last sort of 15 years.
In terms of getting into running at all?
No, 15 years ago I started running.
Is that right?
Yeah, and so the reason being was where I worked, we were fortunate to have an executive coach who came in and worked with us on an individual basis and recognised that I was extremely stressed, I was overweight, unless I changed my lifestyle, there was only one route, which was going to be a heart attack. And so I did 5K. It was a fun run, Santa dress type stuff. Did a 10K, promised my wife I'd never do a half, did a half, promised I'd never do a marathon. I've done London 3 times and a few other marathons. I'll go no further. Anyway, I've signed up for 75 miles this year.
Did you get the bug immediately when you were doing,
it's come up on the podcast before that we're at the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to running experience.
I think it's one of those things that I felt the benefit of. And I was 15 years younger, and I actually felt, I've got some speed here. And so 10Ks, I was doing at a reasonable pace.
So there was a natural ability as well.
But as I've got older, I've realised I've lost the pace.
Right.
And I now need to go for longer, and I can go slower.
Wow. I just cannot fathom the length of some of those races is just mind blowing to me. And as I shuffle around 5K and feel it in my knees for the next week, then I've got no idea how you do it. So a huge amount of respect on that side of things. But in terms of you mentioned there was the executive coach in the former world. So I suppose that's an interesting place to start in terms of your career trajectory. So you were a consultant in the first instance, move across into recruitment. So, do you want to just walk us through that journey?
Yeah. So I see that my career's had 3 phases to it. The sort of first 22 years, I was effectively what I would call client side. So I started off in a shipyard. I wore the blue overalls. I worked as an electrician on nuclear submarines. I've worked in a lot of sort of factory environment on the shop floor. At height in cranes in the days before health and safety was a big issue.
Right.
All right, we just climb up the crane with no harness or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I did my apprenticeship, went to university, got my electrical engineering degree, and went into design office and decided that wasn't quite for me. And started to do more design work, marketing and business development. Went into the corporate development world and worked doing some acquisitions and things like that. Then I moved into the consultancy world, again, nuclear power, at the stations in the UK, and did that for a number of years and worked in Canada and all over. And then I came into recruitment 17, 18 years ago now, as a commercial director, legal director for NES Furcroft. And I've spent my time there. And so worked what is now effectively the world's largest engineering recruitment business across the globe, and learnt my legal trade there. I'm not a lawyer by background, but what I believe I bring is that sort of commercial awareness, that business acumen, and the experience of actually spending 22 years working in those jobs. I did all sorts of jobs. And then the third phase, just over a year ago, became a freelance consultant. So I have my own limited company. So again, I can have that perspective of what does it feel like for a contractor?
Yeah.
All right. And bringing those three together, I think, is what I add value to my clients.
It's quite unique, really. There's not many people who've got that journey to speak to. And I suppose, whilst obviously the initial phase there is an interesting part of it, I suppose the interaction in your certainly knowledge of Qdos and the types of mutual commercial interests that we have would have really been sparked during your time at NES Furcroft.
Yeah.
I mean, during that sort of time, did that business change much? I would imagine over a 15-plus year period, there was quite a substantial change. But was that all growth? How did that materialise?
So, I mean, when I joined, it was probably around 200 million, 5 offices overseas. When I left, it's over 2.5 billion and 70 offices around the world and 8-9 acquisitions. But vast majority is organic growth there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it did change significantly. When I joined, there were 2 people who worked for me who weren't qualified in legal matters. When I finished, there was 30 people in that commercial legal team, compliance team. So, yeah, big changes. And great to be part of that growth strategy.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Yeah. No, it's always exciting being part of a growing business like that. And I think it's an interesting point that you make about not being specifically legally qualified. It's actually something that speaks to me. I'm chartered as an insurance underwriter, which a lot of the time involves looking at insurance contracts, but also commercial contracts as well. And being able to come at that from a sort of an educated perspective, but knowing where to draw the line with legal advice is always an interesting one. But I think recently you'd had a legal intern working with SRC, didn't you? How did that all go?
That went really well because ultimately it was a success. She came to me because she just lacked. She came out of university. She'd done quite a bit of travelling overseas, and then did her LPC. But then had that problem of I can't get a job because I've got no experience. And so over a 4-month period, I was able to give her that experience. She came to some of my clients and meetings. We sort of helped take sort of notes and what have you, and we sat down afterwards. She sent some of the emails to clients, so got to understand how to act professionally with clients, and took on some legal research for me. Probably the worst job she had to do was sit and listen to the Chancellor of the Exchequer's budget speech.
Why? It's brilliant. It's the highlight of our year.
I think that's the day when she realised she had to become a proper adult, as she put it to me. Because I was doing an article for one of the press, and I just needed that information. And she went through that, listened to that, and then went through the report that came out, etc. Which was great for me because then I was able to distill very quickly and write that news article. And she's found it very useful. And she realised that that's something.
Exposed to a lot of kind of it's the practical side of business, isn't it?
Yeah.
I suppose that's what.
But also understanding the etiquette and what is the business behaviour. Because it is very different. And we just had our meal last week to celebrate her getting this job, which she starts 2nd of April in a law firm, and she's now on that trajectory for hopefully getting a training contract, hopefully becoming a solicitor in the future, and moving into what she wants to do. I said, this is your first day now of saying becoming that proper adult. You're in the business world, and these are the things that you need to think about when you step into that office on that first day.
It must have been hugely gratifying giving someone that experience. It was a really touching LinkedIn post that you'd put about that meal that you had. So, I would imagine that young lady's obviously set on a very interesting course. You played a pivotal role in it. Which,
is that something you'll do again?
Yeah, I think if the right person comes up. I mean, the difficulty is that what my clients are buying from SRC is that knowledge that I've got. And so it's difficult to bring out some of the tasks, but there are some tasks. If somebody's expecting to work for 40 hours a week with me, I haven't got that. But if I can give 5-10 hours a week or something, and some of it is like some very basic research to help write another LinkedIn post or do a bit of press article or something like that, or actually do some number crunching or whatever it might be. So yes, I think that there are other opportunities, and we'll see what comes up.
So just in case anyone's not aware of SRC, I mean, how would you describe the business as it stands today?
So I set up SRC, and its full title is Strategic Risk and Compliance Consultancy Limited, say 13 months ago, with the aim of adding value to clients in the professional recruitment sector. All right. I've spent my sort of recruitment life in that sector. with APSCO as well, having been APSCO chair on 2 occasions. So I have that understanding of what is best practice across the industry. And I wanted to be able to offer that to clients. And now SRC has got 17 clients, and I say various degrees of activity.
Yeah.
But we've grown it to 17. And the focus, sort of like the 90-second elevated pitch, is that I want to help clients understand the risks and liabilities, the indemnities, the warranties, whatever you want to call it, in their contracts, to be able to visualize what that might look like, to be able to articulate it, and say in practical terms, what does this actually mean to our business? And then to be able to make a judgment call. Is that something we can accept as it is today? Or is it something that actually we can't accept? And that's where the real skill then comes in, is how do you get to a solution? What is the practical solution that's going to mitigate that risk, or transfer it to insurers, or avoid it in some way? Or ultimately make the decision, this contract is just not acceptable to anybody. Client's not going to budge. We're going to walk away. All right? And it's helping them through that journey.
And that is a difficult thing for a lot of recruiters to do, particularly, the small to medium-sized businesses. There's a lot of money on the table there, and it's, quite galling. We've been in that situation before where, you really want to achieve this deal, but the terms just aren't right. And actually having, a seasoned pro to come in and look at that is a real value, and I think the growth of SRC is a testament to that as well. 13 months and the 17 clients that you mentioned, but I know how hard you work with those clients as well. So it's it's a fascinating business, and I think it's probably relevant to point out in terms of how you first started dealing with Qdos. It was around the IR35 reforms when you were still with NES Furcroft, and I think you and I, our initial conversations were all focused around that, but I think over the years we'd had several other conversations around contractual risk and those sort of they were insurance focused discussions, but certainly that contractual liability piece was at the heart of it all, which is really sort of led to how we've worked together over the last year or so since you've been on your own. So I mean, that sort of brings us to the crux of today's episode in terms of how you approach that risk management piece, and obviously keen to discuss all angles. So I mean, where would you start with a client when you sit down for that first meeting? How do you go about interrogating them to the necessary extent?
First of all, I think it's about understanding what is that opportunity. All right, you need the context, because a set of terms that I would have signed when I was working for the consultancy side in the nuclear industry are a very different set of terms that I would accept as a recruitment business, because ultimately they're not a consultancy, and they should not have liability for the work of the contractors that they're placing. So that context is very important, and that I have a sort of flowchart diagram that I created that 15 years ago, right, when I was first starting off on this journey with in terms of understanding that risk in the business. So context is really important. Then understanding the appetite. What is it the client is prepared to accept? Because of certain business processes that they might have, the way they go about compliance. So understanding that is important. And then it is actually diving into the detail and reading the small print of those contracts. But I do it in a way that I try and step right back. I don't start on page 1. And my clients don't engage me to do a full contract review or a red line. It is, we want you to focus on the liabilities, please, Stephen. So anything to do with pricing, operational matters. If I see something, I'll mention it. But then ultimately, that's not what I'm doing. That's my disclaimer. That's for you to deal with. But I'm focused on the liabilities. And the first thing that I always start is probably Appendix A, Exhibit A, whatever they want to call it, which is where the service that you're delivering is defined. And that service is then underpins, because a lot of these terms of business, clients use for buying a ballpoint pen, for buying a piece of large equipment, for buying the services of a contractor. All right, it's the same terms very often, goods and services. But that appendix is the distinguishing factor.
Exactly.
And if that is very recruitment, go out, search, find, place, payroll for us, do the compliance, magic. All right, that means that contract is going to be a good recruitment contract. As soon as they start building in, we want you to start taking liability for this individual, that's when it gets a bit more hairy.
Obviously, you do see some businesses, though, that do provide sort of both sides of that. So, some genuine consultancy provisions within that recruitment space. I mean, how often do you come across that type of client where there is that genuine consultancy
I've seen reference to consultancy. I've seen reference to statement of work, but I haven't come across a business that does it genuinely.
No.
Bar one.
Okay.
Right.
Which I think if you're starting as a consultancy, then you are probably providing a consultancy service. If you're starting as a recruiter, you're probably not a consultant. Which we've covered on previous episodes, and I'm sure we'll come back to again. But I think you were actually on that point. You were it was a session that I missed, sadly, because obviously fascinating to sit with the HMRC. But I think you were actually at the APSCO HMRC discussion on that contracted out services piece as well. Which,
so I think it was back in September last year. APSCO went along because HMRC invited us to give them an industry perspective on the outsourcing, the statement of work guidance that they were updating. So there was about 10 of us there from various things, and Qdos was obviously there, as Nigel was there as well. And we gave that opportunity to, help HMRC get the language right, because they were using language that wasn't really recognisable in the recruitment industry. And also to so this, when a client is saying they want to do SOW, what does that entail? What does it really mean? And it's not, let's structure it so that they then don't have to do an IR35 SDS. All right, it's got to be genuine. And that was my message constantly. When I really get on my soapbox is when I see clients putting into contracts indemnity on IR35, even for their own errors. And that's when I say that. And I was presenting that position to HMRC, saying, look, this is, I know you can't do anything about it, it's not legal, but this is immoral. And at some stage, I think we need to speak out more about it. So when I get that soapbox opportunity, I do speak out.
And it's going to be an interesting one. Well, firstly, did HMRC seem like they knew what they were
They understood
about?
that, and they did make changes to the codes of practice, the guidance, right? Which made it much more user-friendly for the recruitment industry. But obviously, they couldn't go as far as I would like them to.
No, and we talk. We as you say, we've spoken about this in a different episode. But just that, in terms of how HMRC are actually going to police the whole issue of contracted out services, it's going to be an interesting one, because obviously the I-35 aspect of it, if a client's subject to a review by HMRC, then it goes over to the off-payroll team. The whole issue on contracted out services is more of a contractual, legal point, isn't it? It's about who is bearing that risk. It's not necessarily. It's not a tax. It's not a tax consideration. Whereas obviously HMRC are going to be looking at it through the lens of and with the internal expertise of tax consultants. So it's a difficult one to know who should be advising on those.
Absolutely, and it does feel frustrating that this was unforeseen. So there is this clear grey area that's been created with the off-payroll reforms, where there's the potential for different parties to pick up IR35 exposures in different circumstances, and it allows certain practices to be instilled that moves people outside of that illegitimately, which is obviously what's happened in a lot of cases with the contracted out services model. And the fact that we needed the clarification from HMRC was disappointing, and I still don't think the guidance is up to snuff from HMRC on that. And to Seb's point, seeing how that rolls out in inquiries is going to be fascinating, because it's certainly on the table for discussion in a number of the open cases that we're looking at. Isn't it?
Absolutely.
But I think one of the key things about that guidance, it does put a clear responsibility on the client to make sure that what they're doing is genuine.
Absolutely.
Right? And that was the most important point from a recruitment agency's perspective, is that actually it's you, the client, who is asking for this, and therefore you need to make sure that what you're doing and the way you're behaving and the way you interact with us is truly contracted out service. And so therefore, because you don't have to do an SDS now, but HMRC's view was, well, if we think that's not genuine, then we're going to ask you for an
Exactly.
SDS.
And then you won't have taken reasonable care, and then the liability sits with the hirer. So no, it's counterproductive as a risk mitigation. But no, obviously that does sort of wrap in with that contractual liability piece in general. And I think you've hit on a key theme that you and I have discussed a lot over the last couple of years, which is that the transfer of liability for the actions of workers that recruiters are placing. And I'm always stunned that there are some very, very large firms that we've dealt with who not only will fail to redline those types of terms in contracts, but also have no appreciation of when they're under that level of risk, which is quite frightening. And obviously, as an insurer that underwrites that, we do have to push quite hard. So we're obviously keen to champion anyone like yourselves who are instilling best practice there. But I think it's important to know, and I think you touched on it, that actually it is a legitimate position to take in some cases to say, okay, we are going to take on a contractual liability and we're going to insure that accordingly. But unless a business has appreciation of that and where those risks are, it's impossible for them to actually get that type of cover in place. So how would you suggest a business like that first approaches that contract piece? Is it about sort of standards and practices? How would you start?
So for me, it's about understanding there are various options to managing those risks. Okay, and I talk about what I call a risk dial.
Okay,
all right. So the first one is just avoid it. Right? Don't even enter into the contract.
Yeah.
All right. But that's again not going to be acceptable to most recruitment agencies because they want to do those deals.
Yep.
So the next thing is actually making sure you look at the contract in that detail and identifying those things that are standard recruitment risks and saying, yep, these are fine. We can accept all these. Some of those will be uncapped.
Yep.
All right. And so they should be. At the end of the day, you're getting paid a big fee to go and find some talent. You better do your recruitment job correctly and put your money where your mouth is. And if you get it wrong, then you're going to have to cough up.
Yep.
And that's a PI claim, a professional indemnity claim. All right. But go through and identify which are those acceptable risks. The next one then obviously is to eliminate it. So that is actually, we can't accept that clause and we're going to write that clause out. Or carve out, as what I call it. So I've seen clients putting in their liabilities for employment claims. All right. Now, again, as a recruiter, if those employment-related claims are as a result of our actions, that's our problem.
Yep.
But sometimes those clauses are very broadly drafted and include effectively issues that are created by the client.
Yeah.
For example, discrimination. Why should I, as a recruitment agency, take that liability and indemnify you for your own mistakes?
And that comes back to that moral piece as well,
Absolutely.
doesn't it? That is an immoral stance to take, to completely try and exonerate yourself of any wrongdoing for something like discrimination is very distasteful.
I just put a carve out in that says, look, notwithstanding all of that, if this has arisen as a result of an act or an omission on your part, then the indemnity doesn't stand. And a lot of clients understand that when you actually explain it, because again, I don't think they necessarily see, and this comes back to this sort of being helped to visualise and create and articulate it. When you actually explain, well, that clause actually covers discrimination by you.
Yeah.
They go, oh, well, we didn't mean to give you that. That's fine. Okay. So we're happy to carve that out. So again, if you're in a reasonable conversation with the client, those things can be written out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the next one is to manage.
Yeah.
Is again, there are certain things that you can manage very well. You've got good QA processes, you've got good compliance processes in place, so those risks become acceptable. Whilst on the face of it, they look pretty onerous, but if you've got a good IR35 process and you're using somebody independent like yourselves to run that IR35 process for you, then that's a risk that you can take because you know that you've got it under control.
Yeah.
And then the final one, there are certain risks that ultimately you have to transfer to your insurer. Would that be obviously death and injury and property damage through your public liability or employer's liability insurances?
Yeah.
So it's recognising there is no one answer to this. Yeah. It's made up of different things, and you've got to be. The word I often use is you've got to be agile.
Yeah.
You've got to understand it, and that might have worked in that particular instance, but when you come to this client in this jurisdiction, well, you're going to have to treat it differently because they are your employees.
Yeah.
In the US, for example. So being agile and being able to be flexible is really important.
Yeah.
And I think it's about knowledge building as well. As we've said, there are a lot of businesses that simply aren't aware of where those contractual risks are attaching. So, getting that sort of top-down view of where all of the contractual pieces lies is one of the keys to arranging insurance efficiently as well. So there can actually be circumstances where we have to take fairly negative assumptions about how businesses protected themselves, when there's actually a business that's taken some reasonable steps to add in protections can drive down insurance premiums.
Absolutely.
And it can almost end up paying for itself in some cases. If you're turning down a particularly onerous contract that potentially had some limited earnings attached to it, but was driving your insurance premiums up by 5 figures, then there's some strong commercial justification for actually taking a stronger stance. Coming back to that point about discussing with clients, what type of thing do you find you often get more pushback from in terms of clients not agreeing to changes to terms?
I think it is the vicarious liability, taking the liability for the acts and omissions of the contractor, because they, and again, this is where, again, another key word I use is empathy, trying to understand where the client is coming from, which is the advantage I have because I was there. Right? Where are they coming from? What are they worried about? And they're worried about, particularly if you talk about the US or somewhere like that, co-employment, being seen to be the employer. So they write language about, and IR35 in the UK, they don't want direction, control and supervision, all those sort of things. So there's this, so the view is like, well, if we basically say you're managing those individuals, then how can we ever be accused of having any direction, control and supervision? How can we ever be suggested to be the co-employer? Right? So I can have empathy with that and understand what they're doing. But on the other hand, you need to say, well, if I'm transferring that responsibility to a recruitment agency, are they actually able to do it? And the answer is no. They are consultants behind a desk with a telephone, some very powerful databases, supported by a very good support infrastructure. But at the end of the day, they are not in the ability to manage that work. Right? And it's getting that balance right. All right.
And it's also about looking at other potential avenues there, because the contractors themselves, if they're legitimately self-employed, should be carrying their own insurances and be contractually responsible for their own errors and omissions, which, again, is part of that risk management strategy for agencies, and for agencies to make sure that those contractors are carrying the right type of insurances.
Yeah, but the key thing then the client will argue is that they have no, again, sorry to use a legal term, but no privity of contract, because they don't have a contract with the contractor. That's why they think they should put it onto to the agency, and then the agency goes after the contractor. A practical tip is it actually enable that client to go straight after the contractor by creating that privity of contract. And so I have little clauses in the boilerplates that enable that to happen, right? Because it took away that argument. All right. So so you've got that issue going on, and this. They're not able to do it. But my issue here, though, is if they think they're transferring the responsibility to the recruitment agency, in reality, that's not happening. So the probability of something's going wrong now has gone through the roof. Because nobody is now claiming to manage it. All right? And that's where I then have that conversation with the client that says, you need to think about this differently, because something will go wrong if you think that the agency is managing it, because they're incapable. They just don't have the processes.
Do you think it differs much with where workers are being engaged on via payroll companies, umbrella companies, and how contracts are structured by recruiters in those cases versus bona fide self-employed contractors?
I think with the self-employed, yes, you have a safety net there because they are required to carry their own PI, and they need. But actually trying to enforce all of that, I suggest to my clients, don't rely on that, because as soon as you could bring a claim, they may well cancel that PI insurance. All right, the assets is only what they've got in the bank account at any one point in time, which may not be very much. So, yes, you want to make sure they have that responsibility and they carry those insurances, but don't rely upon that as your mitigation strategy. It's part of it. Which is why you should push back and not accept it in the first place.
Absolutely. But I think what we've seen on the more umbrella and recruitment side of things, the umbrella and payroll side of things, is that There's actually some clauses in fairly standard terms that I genuinely don't think would be legally enforceable, where they're trying to transfer liability, employer's liability. Well, ultimately, the worker is under the supervision, direction, and control of the hirer. Realistically, any court is going to view them as the employer, whilst the contract of services with the payroll company, and there could, in theory, be an employer's liability exposure there. In reality, in the same way as a recruitment business, the payroll company's got no way of controlling that risk, and it's not reasonable to make them liable.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, the sort of employment liabilities and responsibilities, that they should take responsibility for that, because that's what they're being paid to do, is be that employer. All right, and take on those responsibilities. And if there's employment tribunals, they're well versed and well equipped to go and defend those employment tribunal cases and deal with those appropriately. But expecting those payroll companies, and again, I wouldn't. And I was in a position to negotiate with an umbrella company, I wouldn't be asking them to do that. I don't think that's morally correct. And that's not going to happen in reality. So what's the point of putting it in writing like that?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, there are parts of this industry, particularly when we're talking about MSPs, that actually are trying to do that through the chain, and I think that is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. And no, it's all down to housekeeping, but.
Yeah.
I think it's you're very much of the view that this can be used to enhance a business. So we're having a fascinating conversation here about tax and legal terms and all of those pieces. But fundamentally, this underpins an industry and a business structure. So I think you deal with a term called deal velocity,
yes.
Which obviously, as the name would suggest, allows a business to be transacted more quickly. Do you want to sort of elaborate on that a little bit?
So a lot of my clients, what they're doing is they're taking me on as a trusted business advisor.
Yeah.
All right. And they're getting all this legal advice, whether that be internally or externally. But that very often is very black and white, and is a legal opinion, all right, legal advice. Whereas what I bring to the table is that pragmatic, let's find a solution. I've come across this before, whether that be in my historical life or now with my new clients, and said, oh, well, this is how I dealt with it here. This may be a solution for you. So being that sort of trusted business advisor for them. And what I'm trying to do is help them articulate and understand all of that.
Yeah.
Okay. And walk them through those issues. Okay. To find that solution.
Have you got any, I suppose, examples of how that's worked for your clients? And I appreciate, obviously, we're not going to discuss specifics in terms of names and details, but how does that work in a practical example?
Okay, so to me, one of the things, my mission statement is to add shareholder value, or the opposite is help them not destroy shareholder value. Okay, which is what you're trying to do ultimately, and showing that to them that by accepting vicarious liability and some of these very onerous indemnities, because most recruitment businesses at some stage are going to go through an exit, are going to be sold and bought by somebody else. And if they have these unlimited liabilities, some got consequential losses and what have you, the value of that business is significantly reduced, and ultimately a potential buyer might walk away. And I've looked at a number of acquisitions. I've lifted the bonnet up and gone in and done some compliance reviews and gone, they're just not interested.
Really?
All right? Yeah, just not interested. And a couple of my clients at the moment have engaged me to go in and do that for them now. They're on an exit plan in 2 years' time. Yeah. Imagine you coming in, Stephen, as the buyer's DD lawyer, legal lawyer. What would you look at this business? What would you say?
Yeah.
And that's identified a number of red flags, and we're now working through those.
So that you can remedy them. And
And a lot of it is they're doing it, but they haven't got the narrative to explain it.
Yeah.
And that's what's needed.
Yeah.
So they are relatively easy to fix, some of these issues, but you need that narrative to say and demonstrate it.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm doing with those clients to help them through that. And say, build that shareholder value so that they can exit at the right price.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, it's about the value of good housekeeping, isn't it? And it would be nice if these businesses were able to instill that from day one, but I think it would probably hold true. I think it would be pretty ubiquitous that, if you're starting up as a recruitment business, it's an accommodation industry. These people do need to win clients and be flexible with their terms, and starting off and walking away from contracts because you don't like the terms is difficult for smaller firms.
Yeah.
So do you in terms of the organisations that you're working with, do you kind of go into a situation where you do have the commercial side, you have the sales guys who are going out trying to win this business, you already have the legal side, are you kind of sort of sitting in between that?
Absolutely. I mean,
which is I know from experience that is much needed in many cases because there's a huge there's a chasm between
absolutely it. So a number of those clients, some of them I've been engaged directly by the CEO. Right, because they want that somebody because obviously if you're in a position of a chief exec, you don't actually very often have somebody you can sound off.
No.
Right. So actually being able to sit down with somebody and sometimes you're just feeling like they're just rehearsing what they need to say.
Yeah.
But to somebody who actually understands that and actually can go, well, have you thought about that? Have you thought about that? So some of those clients are chief executives who just need that trusted business advisor to sound off and go, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? In other occasions, I have actually been engaged effectively by the sales team who are getting frustrated with their legal team and then going in and trying to work. And so sometimes I'm mediating between the two. But I'm trying to, actually say to the sales guys, look, these deals that you're bringing, this one and this one, they're just not appropriate, right? This is the deals you should not be bringing.
Yeah.
These ones here, they're good ones. Let's do more of that type of business.
Yeah.
But explain it to them in layman's terms, in terms that a recruiter and a sales director can understand.
Yep.
All right, and that's the trick that I will have.
Yeah.
All right, is to be able to explain and give them the example and go, look, well, this is what's happened when it doesn't go right. Okay, when you get your fingers burnt and what have you. Because I mean, ultimately, one of the experiences I had 20 odd years ago is I was sat in front of HSE, Health and Safety Executive, because I had a worker fall off scaffolding when I was painting a roof. Right, and so I could have ended up in jail. Right, because I was effectively the construction manager of that particular site.
Yeah.
But I was able to demonstrate my charge hand, my risk assessments, my method statements, and ultimately it was concluded that the individual was bone idle. He didn't lock the scaffolding tower, and he overleant because he couldn't be bothered to climb down and walk and move the scaffolding tower along. But experiences like that and having your evidence put in the bag, right, certainly bring home these. So I'm not somebody who's going to suddenly start taking on a whole lack of risk.
Yeah.
But I can make the judgment call about what's the probability of that occurring, what's the impact, and is that a risk that's appropriate for this business?
Yeah, and that's often what's missing from a purely legal standpoint.
Correct. So, and then I'm talking to the legal people and trying to help them understand, well, what's this going to look like?
Yeah.
Right? This is a whole load of words here. And yes, those words, I wouldn't ideally like to accept them, but actually in this particular situation, this is what you're being asked to do, and this is what's in reality. Is that really a problem?
Yeah.
All right. And so, yeah, and that's what I enjoy doing, is actually being able to flick between the two. And support both of them, and eventually we are bringing them together, and that's where the deal velocity comes in, because then you get the magic, as I put in that LinkedIn post, of working in partnership, sales and legal in partnership, bringing the right deals in. Legal can turn them around quickly, and the deal is done quicker.
Brilliant. Yeah. Perfect scenario.
The opposite, unfortunately, is deal fatigue.
Which another one of the terms that you've caused, and I think you've sort of touched on both of the points. But that if there is an onerous approach from the legal team, I can imagine how demotivating that is for sales guys. And it does go the other way. If you just brought rubbish after rubbish from your sales team and you're illegal, just not a sensible way of running things. So I would imagine when you're dealing with businesses, though, the actual individuals on both sides of that equation are quite receptive to that.
I mean, sometimes you can go into a business and yes, the person who's effectively your champion, right, whether that's the chief executive or what have you, who brought you in, but other people may, there is some initial resistance because you are coming in and challenging them.
Yeah.
And saying, well, there's an alternative way.
Yeah.
And it takes some time to be able to, and that's where the sort of emotional intelligence then comes in. It's about helping them understand that.
Yeah.
All right. And just taking the time, because don't run too fast with them.
Yeah.
All right. You need to take them through that scenario and help them understand it.
Yeah.
And then eventually it starts to click, particularly when actually then they find they have less work to do because they don't have to redline everything.
Yeah.
Because actually, well, that's a standard risk. We should be able to manage that. We don't need to push back on that.
Yeah.
We can do these type of things. In this instance, actually, that's all that means. Oh, we can do that. And so by reducing that redlining, that's what's called by the deal fatigue, is excessive redlining. Actually, they start to go, actually, I can do these deals quicker, and therefore I can get more satisfaction out of the job. All right, and that's what we're looking to achieve.
And I think an additional benefit of that, speaking as an insurance broker and looking at underwriting risks, being able to speak with whether it is a business owner, a managing director, or even sort of a head of legal or head of compliance that is able to communicate what those standards are, because they know that the sales guys that they're going to be bringing deals to them are not going to be bringing stuff completely off the reservation. Being able to articulate that to your insurer is so valuable. And being able to adequately say, well, yes, we know that we've taken on the risk here.
Yes.
This is the example in which we've taken on that risk, and this is the value of that contract. This is the exposure, and being able to underwrite on that basis is, well, frankly, a pleasure compared to the other side where you're working blind.
In my role, I mean, I would sit down with the underwriter at least once, if not twice a year, and there's a table I would produce, which was red, amber, green. And the green is what I would call the pure recruitment contract. It's very clear. All you're doing is recruitment. The amber is where it's not explicit, but actually it's known between the two parties that you're not taking on vicarious liability.
Yeah.
And then the red is clearly where you're taking on vicarious liability. Yeah. You're doing an engineering service or you're doing a consultancy activity. But being able to go, well, that's a percentage, that's that percentage, and that's that percentage. And if you ask me, I can list out all the contracts that sit in my red. That knowledge gives the underwriters, you say, a lot of confidence. You know what you're doing. And then, okay, I've got those, but this is how I'm mitigating it. I may have put a capital liability on it, for example, the purchase order value. So the worst case scenario is I might lose 100 grand. I can deal with that. All right. Or I've put these extra compliance processes in place, or we've got somebody doing this to check on these type of things. And that mitigation is so important.
And I would imagine, given how diligent you are in that approach back in your NES Furcroft days, I would imagine you were almost at the stage where you could anticipate what the change in insurance costs would be as a result of a contractual decision. And getting to that level for an agency is really, really strong position to be in, because you can weigh up the pros and cons.
Yeah, absolutely.
That whole the whole issue of deal fatigue really resonates.
Yeah.
I guess we've all been in that situation many times. You're just like, oh, is this ever going to end? And you forget what you're actually aiming for in the first place. But is that you talked about adding shareholder value as a mission for SRC. Is another kind of part of that mission to really change the perception of risk management and change it into something that is positive. I remember you saying it about business enabler, something where it is a genuine, something that people think of positively and aren't terrified of.
Absolutely. And I think going back to the very beginning there about my ultra running, at the end of the day, that's the most riskiest thing I do.
Yeah.
Because spending 2 days out in the mountains on your own, right? The preparation that went into that, I thought through all of my risks.
Yeah.
And if you thought about it, you could avoid doing it completely and say, I'm not going to go.
Yeah.
But actually, well, what's the weather forecast?
Yeah.
I had full waterproof gear. Good job, because it absolutely poured down the rain, right? And it was horizontal in your face type stuff.
Yeah.
But it didn't bother me. I was still warm because I had full waterproof gear.
Yeah.
Right? Food, hydration, etc., etc. So that ultra running actually has quite a good way of helping me to manage risk.
Yeah.
Because I'm constantly thinking about it. What happens if I trip over?
Yeah.
Well, I carry my whistle here. Because if I trip over and then broke my arm, I can't get that rucksack off.
Yeah.
Right? I can get to my whistle here and blow whistle or whatever I need to do.
Yeah.
Right? I have a tracker on. Effectively, my watch tracks me.
Yeah.
Right? So my wife knows where I am at any one point in time. She has the route map.
Yeah.
Right? Etc. So it's a bad understanding. I had to cross a river. It was a fast-flowing river with stepping stones. I got to it. I was absolutely petrified. But thinking, right, you've just got to take this step by step.
Yeah.
Right? Don't rush it. What's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to slip. You're going to get your feet absolutely drenched. Well, I'm going to in the next 6 hours. I'm going to get wet anyway. So what's the big deal?
Yeah.
But it's managing that risk. Just go carefully, and step by step work through it.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying to clients.
Yeah.
Right? You're faced with it, and when you first look at it, and you do that first step as well, and you go, oh, this is really nerve-wracking. I really don't like this, right? But you go, hang on a minute, what's the worst? How am I going to manage this? I'm just going to make sure I put my foot carefully down, and then took the next foot down, and just went. And then before you know it, you're the other side, and you think, oh, that was good. But I won't be going back that way.
No. It's one of those. I think it's that impetus point as well, isn't it? That taking those first steps, and you just getting into a rhythm of doing a new way of approaching a task. Sometimes can be really tricky when you look at from a standing start. It can be.
And
can
especially
be
when
hard.
you think the lawyers and what have you, they've got years and years of ingrained knowledge and experiences, and for somebody like myself to come along and go, there's a different way of looking at this, there is going to be resistance to start off with.
Yeah, of course.
But actually, it's about building that trust up and going, but this is what could happen. How do we manage that? How do we make sure that doesn't harm the business? We can do this, this, and this.
Yeah.
Bring it back to your ultra marathon running and the risk side of things. Have you ever had any incidents? Have you been stranded anywhere? Any twisted ankles halfway up?
Well, I twisted my ankle yesterday, but again, that is about training as well. It didn't stop me because I do most of my training on dodgy paths in the first place, so you build up the strength. I think I've had some nightmares. I mean, last year I was in the Langdales in the Lake District. The weather came in bad.
Oh, really?
There was a path called Dungeon Gill, which I've always wanted to go. I've never been there. I used to live in the Lake District, but I'd never been up or down this path. And I got to and it was getting quite late. I've been out for a long time. And I thought, I don't know this path. Looking at the map, again, this is about your risk management, is that you have the map, you know what you're looking for.
Yeah.
That path is going all over the place. I'm not going to take it. And I actually made the decision that I would take a longer route round, which I knew was the typical tourist path, which is a wider path, and there wasn't so many hazards. Got myself down safely. The next day, I had to come back because I need to get back to the top of the hill to carry on the course. I came up Dungeon Gill, and I went, good job.
Correct decision.
It would have been the wrong decision. But it's about being able to make those judgment calls. Particularly when you're tired and what have you. And again, I'm out on my own, and I was high up in the mountains. It was wet and cold, but I carry a 2-man survival tent, effectively. Shelter, because at the end of the day, there are things that could go wrong that are outside my control. And if I need to call mountain rescue or anything like that, I'm going to have to look after myself for 3-4 hours at least, because no one's going to come to you for that length of time. And so a lot of people get into problems because of hypothermia and what have you, because they're not prepared. All right. And I could have called, whistled, or whatever I need to do, get inside this 2-man shelter, and I'd have been snuggling warm.
It's amazing. So many parallels. But,
yes, it is. It is.
Yeah.
Well, that's why you'll see a lot of my posts do that parallel.
Yeah, exactly.
Watch out for this Fridays.
It's always good to have a USP in terms of your LinkedIn content. And, no, certainly true. But I mean, in terms of wrapping things up, we have a question, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, what we generally try to do with guests that we have on the podcast is give the opportunity for you to ask a question of our subscribers, of our readership, and so on. Anything that you like.
Okay. So I think the question I would like to ask, and I would like to do it as a poll, right, to make it simple. So the question is, as a recruitment agency, if you are faced with a contract from a client that contains those onerous liabilities that we've been talking about today, whether that be vicarious liability, consequential loss, indemnities for the client's errors in IR35, whatever, would you accept it? Yes, but reluctantly. Or no, I'll walk away, because you consider that risk is something that's not appropriate for your business and it's going to actually harm shareholder value. And if somebody in the future, when you come to sell your business in 2 years' time, took a look underneath the bonnet and found those types of contracts, they might walk away. So are you going to reluctantly accept it, or are you actually going to say, no, I'm going to be brave here, I'm going to walk away, and I'm going to find some other business. I'm going to find a client that actually respects what I do. Because as a recruitment agency, I'm really good at finding the best talent that you need out there. But don't ask me to do more than what I should be doing.
Excellent question. So no,
going to be a very interesting one.
Yeah.
So, in terms of wrapping things up, firstly, thank you, Stephen, for
it's been
coming.
very enjoyable.
It's been really, really useful, and hopefully we'll have you back on at some point to discuss a few other bits. We've successfully steered the conversation away from IR35, which always seems to be the homing beacon that we head back to. But yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you, and join us next time on your own account. Thank you.
Thank you.